On this edition of the Correspondents, another week, another mass killing in the United States. But is it workplace violence or homegrown terrorism? In Johannesburg, South Africa's Supreme Court convicts athlete Oscar Pistorius of murder, overturning an earlier conviction on a lesser charge. And the list of U.S. presidential hopefuls remains long, but despite mounting criticism, a familiar face extends his lead in the polls. Hello, I'm Mil Arcega, and this is the Correspondents on Voice of America. Well, from Congress to the White House to the campaign trail, politicians and Muslim groups reacted swiftly to Wednesday's mass shooting in California, a shooting that left 14 people dead and 21 others wounded. VOA's Catherine Gibson has more from Washington.
The shooting in California touched off discussion across the country on two divisive issues: terrorism and gun control. President Obama raised terrorism as a possibility while calling for stricter gun laws.
When individuals decide that they want to do somebody harm, we're making it a little harder for them to do it because right now it's just too easy.
Congressional Democrats added to those calls.
We, as the legislative body of this country, do nothing.
What gives us the right to hold moments of silence when we do nothing to act upon the cause of the grief?
Republican presidential candidates framed the shooting as a national security issue.
And all of us are deeply concerned that this is yet another manifestation of terrorism.
What happened last night is not about gun control as much as it is about a problem we have with terrorism.
And for the latest on yet another mass killing in the U.S., VOA reporter-producer Catherine Gibson, whose story you just saw, and joins us in our Washington studio. And she's also joined, as more details on the wheres and the whys emerge, we have VOA national security correspondent Jeff Selden, who joins us here for comments on this as well as other developments this week. Welcome to both of you. Catherine, that was a really good report. It sort of makes you feel kind of helpless in the fact that we simply can't do anything about it. But before we get to that question, are we any closer to finding out what motivated these attacks, why this couple did what they did?
Well, we're learning more because we have law enforcement going into the couple's home. They're taking a look at their laptops, their cell phones. They're seeing the stockpiled rounds of ammunition, the pipe bombs, and of course they'll be scrubbing through their contacts online and looking to see, who were they in contact with in the days leading up to the shooting.
And the more we learn, the more questions we have, Jeff. In your estimation, and you've looked at these kinds of issues in some great detail in the past, is this workplace violence, or are these the actions of a radicalized lone wolf couple?
It could be a little bit of both. There are some indications that maybe there were some problems at work. There seems to have been an argument before the suspect left the party and then returned with his wife, where they started the shooting. But the planning and the amount of ammunition, the amount of material they had at home, the forethought to put on the body armor, to drop their child off with the suspect's mother before going to commit the crime, that suggests a lot of planning, a lot of forethought, and something much more methodical than workplace violence, which would stem from some sort of dispute and then an immediate reaction or a very quick reaction. There was too much in the works to make it just workplace violence.
These were not just the actions of a disgruntled employee, clearly. Right. So what are politicians saying about this? Did some of them perhaps speak a little bit too soon?
Well, this is really dividing into the two camps, the two divisive issues that we get into in politics today in this country, and that's terrorism and gun control. And so we hear from the Republican presidential candidates that this is an issue of terrorism, that this is radical jihad in the United States, and that we need to go out against them and fight it. And then, of course, we hear from the Democratic side and President Obama that this is an issue of gun control and that we need stricter gun laws in this country.
So, Jeff, is this about gun control or is this about terrorism?
It's about trying to figure out what's going on and what makes people tick in just the way that you can look at and you talk to most of the neighbors, and we've seen the reports, seemed like a nice couple, seemed like a normal family, didn't seem like there was anything unusual, and then next thing you know, they're at this community center shooting it up and then getting into a suicide shootout with the police forces. So part of the issue is going to be, and something that investigators are looking at, is what was going on, what was underneath the surface that wasn't readily apparent. And it's not just in this case, but it's in most of these cases where you can have kids, and more when they do the profiles of the youngsters, the youth who are going and getting entrapped online and joining up with the jihadist groups, whether it's the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or any of the others. What is it that you go from a normal seeming kid to someone who's so willing to buy into this narrative of violence and destruction?
But we do know this 28-year-old man, Syed Farouk, and his wife, I assume, Tashin Malik, they were in Egypt. Did they not visit to Saudi Arabia?
It was Saudi
Pakistan?
Arabia, and interestingly, the Saudi embassy in the U.S. even issued a tweet talking about in the summer of 2014 how they were there, and saying and making a point to say that the wife was not a Saudi citizen. So this is something that's bigger than just the U.S. because they had Pakistani origins, they had traveled overseas. So the investigation, while it's focusing right now on the scene and on the stuff that they had and trying to get some of the data, scrub some of the data off the cell phones and the computers, which they tried to destroy. Part of this is going wider and seeing what type of network did they tap into, possibly, that helped lead them to this. One of the other interesting things that they're going to be looking for is the signatures, the way they built the pipe bombs, the way they gathered the material. Does it fit neatly into the MO of one group or another? And that's something that still's got to be determined.
But nothing about this case fits anything very neatly at all. We've got a couple here with a 6-month-old baby. How does a couple like that become radicalized and end up storing, 5,000 rounds of ammo, building pipe bombs, and nobody knows anything about it? How does something like that happen? On a personal level, do you find that hard to believe?
Oh, absolutely. The idea that you would drop off your child knowing that you probably would never see them again is, that's the million-dollar question. How do you get to that point?
How do we get to this point?
And especially for a woman, if you remember with the investigations following the bombing in Paris, when they went into that one apartment, it was big news when at first they thought that one of the female suspects in the apartment actually blew herself up as a suicide bomber. While it happens in some places in the Middle East, it's unusual, and in the West it's even more unusual. And here clearly it seems that you had a woman who was willing to be part of what was, if it wasn't a suicide bombing, it was still a suicide operation in the end. And that's something that investigators are going to take a hard look at, because it suggests there was a lot more going on underneath the surface.
No, absolutely a lot more going on underneath the surface, but I guess I can't let you go until we talk about what happened earlier this week. We had Defense Secretary Ash Carter talking about the U.S. strategy, the U.S. response to Islamic State. In fact, frankly, I'm quite surprised that Islamic State or Daesh has not taken credit for this. But does U.S. strategy at all deal with some of these aspects of lone wolf kinds of terrorist acts that are happening right here in our country?
Well, 2 points. First, with the claim of responsibility, it's not always immediate. A lot of times when you think back, it feels like it was immediate, but sometimes these groups, they take days, sometimes even weeks before they say they were the ones behind it. In terms of the strategy, what Defense Secretary Carter told lawmakers is he unveiled a new strategy talking about putting what they're calling a special expeditionary targeting force into Iraq, basing it there, fewer than about 100 people, trigger pullers, commandos, to specifically gain more intel to set up future operations, build on stuff that they had done before. He said part of it is an effort to hit the Islamic State Daesh much, much harder in their heartland, because it's very hard to target and to find the lone wolves, the people who are just inspired. But what the United States is now saying, if you can really degrade and destroy, and they're using the word destroy much more now, the Islamic State in the areas it controls, in the areas it says is part of its nascent caliphate, that's going to have the biggest impact.
So, Catherine, what's the potential here for a backlash against the Muslim community? I know you heard from Muslim leaders yesterday. What are they saying?
Right. Well, we saw this topic trending on Twitter. We saw Muslim killers centered around the shootings, and I spoke with one Muslim leader who said, we have quite a few mass shootings in the United States now, and we had a Planned Parenthood
shooting. Let's not blame it on
Right, we had a Planned Parenthood shooting last week, but we didn't blame it on Christian killers.
Right,
why should we blame this shooting on Muslim killers? We really need to step back and find some balance here.
I look forward to hearing reports from both you, Catherine, and Jeff Sullivan on this. Again, thank you very much for joining us. We're taking a quick break right now, but when we come back, we go to South Africa for the latest twist in the Oscar Pistorius story. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.
My name's Carla Babb, and I work the Pentagon beat. That access helps me to do better stories. Every day it's my responsibility to collect all of the defense news. It keeps our VOA viewers informed. I get to travel all across the globe. Anything that's defense related and how to protect and keep people safe, that's where I'll go. So it's never a dull moment at the Pentagon. My name is Carla Babb. This is my beat.
Music is an essential part of who I am, who my family is, and where I come from. Our show that is jazz-focused is called Beyond a Category, and we take a very broad concept of what jazz is, but we look about bringing in the greatest jazz artists working to talk about their music and to hear them play.
How do you see the world?
I see countries in turmoil.
I see our planet changing.
I see people at peace.
No matter how you see the world, you'll get an unbiased and uncensored view of it on Voice of America. On television, radio, online, and mobile. In more than 40 languages all day, every day. Millions of people tune us in.
How do I see the world? On Voice of America.
And welcome back to The Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Mil Arcega in Washington. Well, as you know, a big development in the case of Oscar Pistorius, also known as Blade Runner, South Africa's double amputee athlete convicted of culpable homicide in 2014. Now, South Africa's Supreme Court convicted him of murder this week, overturning the lesser earlier conviction. A court justice explained why this case was revisited.
The principles of dolus eventualis, including error in objecto, were incorrectly applied to the facts found to be proved relevant to the conduct of the accused. And two, the trial court did not correctly conceive and apply the legal principles pertaining to circumstantial evidence.
The court announced its ruling Thursday in the case against the Olympic star who was convicted last year of the 2013 shooting death of his girlfriend, Reeva Steenkamp. Her family was in court Thursday. The case now goes back to the trial court so it can determine a new sentence. Pistorius was supposed to serve the rest of his sentence on culpable homicide under house arrest, but that's now likely to change. And joining us now to make some sense of this latest legal twist in the Oscar Pistorius story, we have VOA correspondent Anita Powell, who joins us on Skype from Johannesburg. Anita has been following the Pistorius saga for years, and joining us also here in Washington, our resident sports expert, VOA's Sonny Young, host of VOA's Sunny Side of Sports. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Mil.
Anita, it's good to have you back. I didn't quite understand the Latin, but I'm pretty sure it's not what Pistorius wanted to hear. What does this new conviction mean for the Blade Runner?
Right. So the bottom line for Oscar Pistorius is he is going back to prison. He'll appear before a trial court judge probably in the new year. I think that's the soonest that they can schedule that. And with this new conviction, the judge, whoever it is, will have to determine how long his sentence will be. Conventionally, we're looking at a minimum of 15 years. Mm-hmm. Of course, you might be eligible for parole after maybe as little as 3. They'll have to take into account the time he's already served.
So where was Pistorius when this ruling was made, and what kind of a reaction are you hearing from his legal team?
He was right where he was supposed to be, under house arrest at his uncle's mansion in Pretoria. His family issued a really, really terse statement right after, just saying they'd taken note of the judgment. So that's, and that they're evaluating their options, but they don't really have many.
No, they don't, huh? That we're taking note. Wow. Sonny, this guy, obviously, as you know, you've covered him. He was an Olympic hero, a role model for so many people with disabilities. What happens to his career now as an athlete? Is that over?
Mil, I think it's highly likely that Oscar Pistorius, his competitive athletics career is over. 3 years ago, he became the first amputee runner to compete in a full-bodied race at the 2012 London Olympics. I remember him carrying the South African flag at the opening ceremony of the Paralympics in London. at that stage of his career, by far, he was maybe the most well-known disabled athlete in the world. And yeah, he's a fallen hero at this point.
It's certainly a tragedy for Oscar Pistorius. But what about the impact this is going to have on the millions of fans he has, and all those disabled athletes who looked at him really as a role model?
Yeah, I think he, like as I said, he's fallen from his pedestal from his glory days on the track. I don't see Pistorius being held up in much regard by disabled athletes at this point. I think, I think he's finished.
And I guess, Anita, this is probably one of the reasons why this story is so fascinating, how the mighty have fallen. One of the judges described this Pistorius case as a Shakespearean tragedy. Is that why you think people find his story so fascinating, his rise to the very pinnacle of his career, and then all of a sudden his sudden downfall?
Well, of course. I mean, everybody likes to see the hero fall. That's the classic Greek narrative. But I mean, this story is a fantastic combination of things that people really care about: sex, death, beauty,
right?
Sports. I mean, it's all in there.
So Sonny, obviously this fascination from all of us watching on the sidelines. We wish we could reach those kinds of heights, and all of a sudden somebody we've been following so much all of a sudden lands in such a terrible, tragic way. If there was a lesson here for other kinds of celebrities, other sports figures, what would that be?
That's a tough question, Mil. Pistorius, from my understanding of him, he's always had a fascination with guns and weapons. That was one of his hobbies, to go out to the firing range. I read an in-depth profile of him that talked about his temper, which the prosecutors brought out in this trial. The way
a real Greek tragedy, a real tragic kind of a flawed hero, right?
The only athlete I can compare him to, and they were at different stages of their career, O.J. Simpson, the murder trial 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. However, O.J. was acquitted in that trial, and then he was later convicted in a separate trial. It was not quite as
clear-cut as this one seems.
And he was retired at that point. He was not in the prime of his athletic career.
Unlike Pistorius. So, Anita, I'm curious from a legal point of view, what happens next?
So in terms of Oscar's options, as I mentioned, he doesn't have very many. He could choose to appeal to the Constitutional Court. That's the highest court in the land. The court that he just was, that he just passed through was the Supreme Court of Appeals. He could go up to the Constitutional Court, and I suppose he could argue that the case was never really fair. And that's maybe an interesting, valid argument in that, this case was conducted under intense public scrutiny.
Yeah.
The problem is that would take a long time and that would cost a lot of money, and he doesn't really have it. So he's got to make that decision.
I'm curious, though, does this mean that when you convert one charge from essentially manslaughter to one of essentially first-degree murder, does that mean he has to face another trial, or does he? Because I'm not a lawyer, but it almost sounds like double jeopardy if that was the case.
No, and that's a really interesting point. So this is a big difference between the American legal system and the South African legal system. In South Africa, we do not have jury trials. Everything is decided by judges. Mm-hmm. And that's a really critical point.
Right.
Because basically the appeal that the prosecution presented, the one that just passed and led to the conviction for murder, was on the grounds of legal interpretation. The prosecution said that the original judge made a legal judgment error in convicting him of culpable homicide. And so they didn't introduce new evidence. They didn't get new witnesses. They just looked at what they had in the other trial and said, is there a different legal judgment that we can make? And clearly, yes.
Thank you, Barrister Anita. And Sonny, thank you so much. We'll look forward to hearing the follow-up reports from both of you. It's time for another break, but when we come back, the clear frontrunner for the Republican Party's nomination for U.S. President in 2016 continues to show remarkable staying power. But just a reminder, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.
I'm Jim Malone, and I work the political beat. I cover what drives the political issues in the United States, what voters think, what drives the candidates, how public opinion shifts on one issue or another. It keeps you in touch with the American people and where they want the country to go. It's a great way to get a window on what's happening in the United States. I'm Jim Malone, and my beat is U.S. politics.
Hamilton Live is a live audience performance. With live music, you have that interaction. There's nothing like getting that immediate feedback from the folks that you're performing to. They feel it and they respond back to you. You see it in their eyes. You know that you're connected with them. Like if any form of communication, it's that response that you get back.
Wherever you are, Voice of America is on air, reaching more than 130 million weekly, worldwide, in more than 40 languages. Online, social media, and breaking news from around the world. On the go, dozens of new features on popular platforms with new apps and trending topics. Voice of America, on air, online, on the go.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Mil Arcega in Washington. Well, real estate mogul and reality TV star Donald Trump appears to have solidified his lead in the Republican presidential race. Based on the latest national polling by Quinnipiac University, Trump, now at 27%, is well ahead of his closest rival, Florida Senator Marco Rubio, who is now at 17%, followed by Ben Carson and Texas Senator Ted Cruz, each with 16%. The surge in Trump's popularity comes amid intense scrutiny that's kept his campaign mostly on the defensive in recent weeks. Here's more from VOA national correspondent Jim Malone.
Donald Trump continues to soar above the rest of the Republican field, in part due to his skills as a master showman.
This is what I call a real supporter.
But Trump is getting greater scrutiny after insisting that thousands of Muslims in New Jersey celebrated on the day of the 9/11 attacks, even though no credible evidence has come to light.
I said very strongly and very correctly, I said, there are people over there, and they were dancing in the street, and they were dancing on rooftops.
Rivals, including New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, saw an opening.
It didn't happen. And the fact is that people can say anything, but the facts are the facts, and that did not happen in New Jersey that day, and it hasn't happened since.
But Trump refuses to back down.
You know what? There's nothing wrong with an apology, but you have to be wrong. I believe in apologizing, but you have to be wrong.
And for more on the Teflon candidate, VOA national correspondent Jim Malone, whose voice you just heard in that report, joins us here in Studio 48. And to talk about the impact of this race on Capitol Hill and the rest of the candidates, here's VOA congressional correspondent Cindy Sain. Welcome to both of you. Yes. I always love talking to the both of you. Jim Malone, usually faced with facts, a typical national candidate would already be tweeting an apology or backtracking. How does Trump get away with it?
Well, he's been doing it for many months now, and he has defied the pundits and prognosticators about his staying power. In fact, since that piece was done, we have another poll, a CNN ORC poll. Trump is at 36% in this latest poll, 20 points ahead of his nearest challenger, which is now Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas. So we are looking at Trump surging again, and I think a lot of this may have to come in the wake of the Paris terror attacks, and who knows what the impact of this latest California shooting will be on the race as well.
Well, before we get to some of those really tough international issues, let me ask you, Cindy, what impact is Trump's sort of take no prisoners style, brash go ahead and keep lying? If you say something often enough, it becomes the truth. How is that affecting the rest of the candidates in this field? Are they essentially trying to do the same thing? Are they going to try to out-Trump Trump? How are they reacting to his tactics?
Well, as Jim mentioned, Senator Ted Cruz, and he is employing a lot of the same rhetoric. After the California shooting, he said we are at war.
But he's not pushing back against Trump, is he?
He's not pushing back. He's more or less sounding the same themes. And I think that, I'm not sure, it's sort of a chicken and the egg question whether Donald Trump is tapping into sentiment that's already out there among a lot of Republican voters. It's an anxious time with the Paris attacks, with the mass shootings happening almost on a weekly basis. And I'm hearing it seems that people are getting a bit more open and talking about whether it's the Syrian and Iraqi refugees. We need to halt that. The House passed a bill saying, we need to make sure that they're not a threat. And it seems that there's a climate of fear. And Trump is benefiting from this greatly. I think some people are looking for a person of strength.
Trump's an outsider. You would have thought he would not do as well when it comes to handling something like terrorism, that would favor more experienced candidates, Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, not playing out that way so far. So the dynamic in the Republican race right now, Trump is not being stopped by anyone. The next opportunity may come in the debate less than 2 weeks away in Las Vegas.
Clearly there is this desire for an anti-establishment kind of candidate. Is that something the GOP establishment folks need to be worried about?
Well, they are worried about it. The other anti-establishment candidate, we should point out, Ben Carson, has been falling in the polls. Probably because of the concerns about foreign policy and security, and he has not stepped up to the plate on that as well as some people would like. There was a big New York Times story this week about party leaders worried about Trump. Do they confront him? Do they try to take him on? How do they stop him? What happens if he becomes the nominee? There's fears they could lose control of the Senate next year in the elections as well. But right now, it's like having a tiger by the tail. 50 years ago, this wouldn't have happened, by the way, Mil. The party bosses controlled the party. Not the case anymore. Now the grassroots is in control of this process at the moment, and the party bosses can do little about it.
So Cindy, to get back to the point you were trying to make, is Trump actually driving some of this anti-Muslim sentiment, this anti-immigration sentiment, or has he just basically tapped onto something that's always been out there in the public, and he's just sort of raise that a notch higher?
Right, that's a good question, Mil. I think both are sort of reinforcing each other, that he's tapped into something and that people are feeling maybe more comfortable about saying out loud. And as Jim said, there's sort of been one lone voice this week, Senator Lindsey Graham, who's registering about 1% in the polls, doesn't have much of a chance. But he took on Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and said, look, if one of these people is our nominee, we're going to lose. These people have gone to extreme positions on immigration and on abortion, and they're alienating Latino voters and they're alienating women voters, and these people are not going to be able to win in a general election, which goes back to what Jim said, that some of the establishment people are really getting worried.
Jim Malone, is it time for Jeb Bush to hang his hat?
I don't know. At the latest CNN poll I just talked about, he's down to 3%.
Yeah,
that's pretty low. Look, it'll start to get sorted out in Iowa and New Hampshire early February, okay? But right now, Trump's near the top in both of those states. If he does first or second in Iowa, wins New Hampshire, then the race turns to the south. He'll be very strong there. I think I would look now for New Hampshire, someone like a Chris Christie, someone to take Trump on directly as maybe the best hope of the party establishment to try to kind of cut back on his momentum.
Very quickly, I'm wondering if all this attention on the GOP candidates and on Trump is hurting or helping Democrats.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it looks like Hillary is doing pretty well. Some more of her emails were released, and there was nothing, sort of no smoking gun, so she seems to be strong.
But again, I think we're seeing also that anti-establishment factor there, which is helping Bernie Sanders. But thank you, Jim, and thank you, Cindy, and thank you to all our correspondents. That is all the time we have, but we'll be back again next week for another edition of The Correspondents. We invite you to stay up to date through the weekend. Visit us at voanews.com for all the latest developments. Do check it out. I'm Mil Arcega. For now, so long from Washington.